Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. This is Cutting Emissions for a Post-Pandemic World, Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform and Carbon Pricing. So my name is Richard Bridle. I hope everyone's able to hear me okay. So we've got a fantastic cast of characters today who will be speaking at our webinar. We're going to tackle some of the major issues facing the recovery in the post-pandemic era, and looking particularly at the fiscal measures, including subsidy reform and energy taxes and carbon pricing. So I'm very pleased to say that we've got some opening remarks from the Finnish climate ambassador Jan Wahlberg. So Jan, if you're on the line now, if you can share your screen, if you want to turn your video on, then we'd welcome a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Richard. I think I have my video on and my voice on. Do you hear me and can you see me?
Yes, there you are. Fantastic. Okay. Thank you, Jan. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. Okay, so I have the honor to open the seminar. Dear ladies and gentlemen, friends, our excellent speakers and panelists, it is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you to this webinar. And I'm glad that during these exceptional times, we have found new ways of working and keeping the discussion ongoing in these important topics. Actually, I might add that I've only been working as a climate ambassador for a couple of weeks, so all my work has been done from this chair. I think it's a very climate-friendly way, but I do hope to see you also in physical life sometime in the near future. As we have now experienced, the COVID-19 pandemic has created an unprecedented shock to the economies across the world. Countries are coping with the acute stage of the pandemic, but simultaneously planning how to finance the recovery and how to direct the stimulus packages to benefit the society at the best possible way. The fiscal recovery packages by governments and the choices made by private investors influence significantly to the long-term impact on climate and also more widely on environment and our health. To ensure green recovery in Finland, my Minister for Environment and Climate Change set up a working group to draft proposals for sustainable recovery in terms of climate and natural environment. This work strengthens Finland's transition to carbon neutral fossil fuel economy even after the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, we are particularly working on solutions related to circular economy in the national, but also at the international fora to deliver systemic sustainable models around the globe. This work is a part of Finland's positive climate agenda, which, among other things, includes promoting carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidy reform. Furthermore, we think that rule-based trade regime and market access for climate-friendly technology and services globally are central in advancing the transition towards a healthier, carbon-neutral, post-pandemic world. Finland is and has been a forerunner in the world work towards climate-neutral future. We have a long history of environmental taxation, and we are a member of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. In 2019, the finance ministers of Finland and Chile, with the support of World Bank's Climate Action Peer Exchange, agreed to co-lead the coalition of finance ministers for climate action. I believe the Sherpas of this coalition, they are having a meeting also today, and they are preparing ministerial statements on the COVID crisis. So a very meaningful and important coalition. And today, already around 50 countries have committed to the Helsinki principles of this coalition. And notably, the principle number 3 calls for work towards measures that result in effective carbon pricing. This includes the need to reform fossil fuel subsidies and to find an effective price on carbon emissions. Furthermore, the objective of the coalition is to bring climate change into part of the planning of broader economic policy and financing solutions. The coalition stresses the cost effectiveness of the transition to a carbon neutral economy and the need to take into account the impacts on the income distribution. Fossil fuel subsidies reform is a prerequisite for effective carbon pricing. I am looking forward for today's presentations, which I hope will explain better this connection. The current pandemic and climate change are both global crises, which have impacts on every nation and on each individual. Primarily, they affect our health and deliver spillover effects further to all societal systems. Global cooperation and solidarity provide keys to rebuild societies in a sustainable way and provide support to those who suffer this crisis most. The decisions we make now enable us to lock the direction of our economic development towards sustainable, climate-resilient future. Through green and sustainable stimulus, economic growth can be decoupled from greenhouse gas emissions and other environmentally harmful externalities. By doing right choices now, we can strengthen our work towards carbon-neutral economies and commitments made under the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda. According to International Energy Agency and OECD estimates, annual fossil fuel production and consumption subsidies amount for 350 to 600 billion US dollars, depending on the oil price. Now, of course, we have seen that the oil price has reached its historical low, and the effects of this are to be seen in the near future. However, if we had the chance to reallocate, let's say 600 billion US dollars, would we rather invest it to, for example, in green technology, which is free from environmentally harmful externalities, or maybe in education? Do we want a better, sustainable future? I think this is a question that we should all think about. We know that the fossil fuel subsidies distort market mechanisms and lead to higher production and consumption of fossil fuels than would be optimal. These subsidies also weaken the competitiveness of low carbon alternatives and decrease their demand and entry into the market. In addition, the extraction and utilization of fossil fuels cause negative externalities that are weakly, if at all, priced through markets. For this reason, finding an effective price on carbon is extremely important. Well, with these welcoming words, I would like to wish you a very insightful webinar. And now at this point, I would like to leave, not the floor because I cannot do that, but I can leave the screen for Iveta Geramsinchuk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And before we go to the presentations from Iveta, I'm just going to have a few words from our director, Peter Wooders, to introduce the webinar as well. So Peter, would you like to take the floor, please?
I certainly would. Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much, Ambassador Wahlberg. And thank you all for joining the webinar today and for taking your time out of your schedules to join with us. I wanted to let you know that this webinar today is brought to you by the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group, which is a group of 9 non-G20 countries who've been committed to driving fossil fuel subsidy reform since 2010. And they do that through a variety of international and national initiatives. And Finland is one of the founding members of that group. And it's also brought to you by us at the IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and its Global Subsidies Initiative. And we are similarly committed to helping countries identify subsidies which act against sustainable development and then reform them using the best practices from around the world. And you'll hear from several of our colleagues in VETA as one of those during the webinar today. I think we've seen so far that governments have rightly been focusing their efforts on the COVID-19 health crisis. And it's heartening to see in many countries now the number of cases and the number of tragic deaths falling. And we commend and thank governments for this strong and timely response. But it's also very clear that in the aftermath of that crisis, governments must react to rising budget deficits and the need to stimulate their economies, their damaged economies, as Ambassador Wahlberg very cogently pointed out. We need to make those finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, i.e. Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And we're looking today to see what role that carbon pricing and subsidy reform can contribute to post-pandemic recovery and the stimulus measures. It's very clear that governments are going to be short of money now for quite some time. There's going to be a lot of calls on that finance as well, be that immediate recovery or wage support or health systems or investing in stimulus and recovery going forward. And we think that both fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon pricing can help generate more public finance, which is going to be very, very urgently needed in the months and years ahead. Also during the webinar, we'll be talking to a working paper that IISD has been completing in the last few months. It's the same title as the webinar, Cutting Emissions for a Post-Pandemic World, Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform and Carbon Pricing. And it really deals with the issue that governments are continuing to simultaneously apply taxes, subsidies, and carbon pricing, carbon markets to many sectors of the economy, often for historical, institutional, political reasons. But that coexistence is happening. It's probably necessary. It's going to continue to happen. And we want to get an idea of how those policies can work together and what the aggregate demand, the aggregate impact would be. And again, as Ambassador Valberg mentioned, the effective carbon price and the effective carbon signals are very, very important here. So I won't say too much more. I think we've got a great lineup today, and it's really good to be investigating these issues and thinking really how we can effectively as a group come together and respond to this pandemic, and what sort of policies and initiatives we'd like to see governments take forward, and how we might help convince them to do so. So I'll now hand over back to our moderator, Richard. We didn't introduce him earlier. He's got a strong history of project development and technical services within renewable energy projects, and has built on this in his energy work at the IISD. He's one of the leading authors of the paper we're going to be introducing today. So Richard, briefly back to you, and I think you'll probably introduce Iveta straight away.
Hello, thank you. Yes, as Peter mentioned, I'm Richard Bridle, Senior Policy Advisor at IISD, and I'm a moderator for today. Just a couple of items of housekeeping before we move to the 4 presentations, and those are particularly around the Q&A for today. So at the end of the presentations, we've got a number of respondents, and then we're going to have questions from the audience. So if at any point during the webinar you go down to the bottom of the screen and click on the Q&A button, you can submit questions, and we will be monitoring these questions, and at the end we'll put a selection of them to the speakers. So you can allocate a question to a particular speaker, or you can ask the panel generally. And whenever you submit those, we'll keep a track of them and ask a selection at the end. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first presentation, and this is Iveta Gerasmenchuk, another Senior Policy Advisor and Lead for Sustainable Energy Supplies at IISD, and she will be speaking about the paper that Peter has already mentioned. So Iveta,
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. The paper we're going to present and publish a bit later with the Nordic Council of Ministers is a collaboration of several colleagues from IISD and outside of the IISD. So it's Joachim Roth, Richard Bridle, Laura Merrill, Frédéric Gagnon-Lebrun, and myself. And I'm also going to touch very briefly on the current situation and the status of fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon pricing now in the face of the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, please. This is, of course, a human tragedy, the COVID-19 crisis, but we are also facing the climate crisis, and we need to remember about it. As Ambassador Valberg mentioned, the decisions that governments take today lock in emissions or help us avoid those emissions for decades to come. The signal that market participants, consumers are getting comes from 3 main components. So you can see this triangle here. It's carbon pricing explicitly, it's energy taxation, and it's also fossil fuel subsidies or their reform. And we need to connect all these dots in today's discussion. Next slide, please. So For the situation with fossil fuel subsidies, as again Ambassador Wahlberg mentioned, their value is fluctuating with oil prices, and it's made up of the value of consumption subsidies and production subsidies, although they are linked with oil price in diametrically opposite ways. So consumption subsidies will go down this year. If oil price averages at around $30 per barrel in 2020, they will go down from around 400 billion in 2018 to roughly 200 billion. And this situation is similar to 2015 when a lot of countries, over 40 countries, used the low oil price opportunity to get rid of consumption subsidies. But at the same time, the challenge is really locking in those reforms, because what we saw later, and can see again as we come out of the economic downturn, that if oil price goes up, countries are challenged to backslide on their reforms and reintroduce subsidies. With production subsidies, it's the opposite situation. Producers are struggling when oil prices are low. So they're asking now for government support and bailouts. And we know that already before the crisis, a lot of fossil fuel production dependent and was only viable because of government support at about $100 billion per year. And we estimate that, of course, unfortunately this year, this number will go up. On the next slide, we can see the examples of those countries that have reformed their fossil fuel subsidies, mostly for consumption, but also some countries reformed them for production. Even though that's encouraging and there has been a lot of progress made, in particular in countries such as India, but overall, almost everywhere we look, there are fossil fuel subsidies. We know that there is a G20 and APEC members' commitment to reform them over medium term. However, this commitment is also more than 10 years old now, and subsidies still haven't been reformed. So there is still a lot of work to be done. Next slide, please. In terms of carbon pricing, we are going to have a presentation by Sebastian, who will talk about the latest trends. Here, what I'd like to say is that, of course, we hear now more and more about carbon pricing. In their indices, 96 countries representing 55% of global emissions mentioned some form of introducing of carbon pricing policies, but this is explicit carbon pricing in the form of emissions trading schemes, such as in the EU ETS, or through carbon taxation. But there is also implicit carbon pricing, which comes in the form of energy taxes, such as excise taxes or just VAT, because this type of taxation also increases the cost of energy and therefore influences consumer decisions. And very often implicit carbon pricing actually in terms of cents per liter or kilowatt hour account for a bigger expense than explicit carbon pricing. Which brings me to the next slide, showing examples from certain economies. And here you'll see three main components. So we have in green the biggest revenue for governments of those countries coming from implicit carbon pricing from gasoline and diesel excises. Then in blue, we can see how much governments are earning from carbon pricing explicitly. And then in red, in negative, are fossil fuel subsidies. And it may sound intuitive that countries, even developed countries, are both taxing and subsidizing fossil fuels at the same time. But in fact, that's what's going on almost everywhere. And very often it's different sectors which are subsidized and taxed. For instance, agriculture can be subsidized, residential users can be subsidized, but industry will be taxed, or transport will be taxed. So it really depends on the country. Also, subsidies include not just direct transfer funds, but also tax exemptions, including exemptions from the carbon tax, which, for instance, explains the numbers here for Sweden. But overall, it's a confusing picture. And if you feel confused, imagine how markets are confused. And still, until now, we're not sending a consistent signal in terms of mitigation to all sectors. On the next slide, we will again look at a different way to talk about fossil fuel subsidies as a negative carbon price in terms of their value per ton of CO2, the metric we are used to for explicit carbon pricing. And you can see that in a sample of 25 countries, the value of fossil fuel subsidies per ton of CO2 varies from next to zero to over $100 per ton. And on average, in those 25 countries, it's $27 per ton of CO2. So my colleague Andrea Bassi will talk, who is also co-author of the paper with NCM, we'll talk about the ways we model and look at the impact of fossil fuel subsidies and energy taxation on demand and therefore on emissions. So coming more towards the current moment, what it means right now in the next slide, as we mentioned at the beginning, we need recovery. We also need funding for recovery. And as Ambassador Wahlberg mentioned, fossil fuel subsidies represent a big opportunity cost. So we can be using the same financial resources for healthcare, for education, for creating jobs in the clean sectors of the economy, green sectors of the economy. And right now, it's an opportune moment for reform of consumption subsidies, definitely, but the challenge is going to be ratchet them for the future. And also, it is an opportune moment for taxing fossil fuels more because oil is so cheap at the moment. So we've done a simple calculation at IISD that a simple tax of just 12.5 US cents per liter of gasoline and diesel would generate $1 billion per day. And over 3 years, this will amount to 1 trillion, which is a huge amount of money, and it's 20% of what G20 have committed for recovery. But more importantly, such a tax will also still leave gasoline and diesel prices at a low level. So for example, we know that in the United States or in Germany, oil price, gasoline prices at the pump decreased by 27-30 cents per liter since the beginning of the COVID crisis. And what we are proposing here is less than half of that. I'm also pleased to say that some countries understand this logic. And for instance, India raised excise duty on gasoline and diesel by 50% already. Costa Rica is doing about the same, and both countries are explicitly linking these reforms to the need to mobilize funding for the COVID recovery. And this makes these reforms more politically acceptable. So coming to the last and concluding slide, we want to stress that for the way forward, for the post-pandemic world, of course, fossil fuel subsidies act as a negative price, and they undermine other carbon pricing mechanisms. We have a commitment in the Paris Agreement to align financial flows with climate targets, and fossil fuel subsidies are a form of such financial flow. So we need to reform them, it's also important to keep the overall picture of carbon pricing explicit and implicit, implicit through energy taxation, fossil fuel subsidies to convey consistent mitigation signals to the market. There is a big risk now through the stimulus of introduction of more fossil fuel subsidies, especially for production. But at the same time, there is also an opportunity to support green stimulus. These funds are extremely needed at the moment, so we need to discuss best uses for the scarce resources that we have at hand, and also need to look at the right arguments and the right science to support reforms. So with that, I'm concluding, and I'm handing over the floor back to Richard. Richard, thank you very much for helping me with the slides.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Iveta. That was a fascinating presentation, and now we're going to hear a little bit more about the concept of the impact of subsidies on subsidies as a negative carbon price. So, and also on some of the modelling work that went into the analysis that Iveta presented at a high level. So I'd like to introduce Andrea Bassi. He's a very experienced modeler and associate of IISD, and also an extraordinary associate of the Stellenbosch University. So Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everyone. I hope that you're able to see my slide by now. And as Richard mentioned, I'll be talking a bit about how do fossil fuel subsidies create an effective negative carbon price, and effectively how we estimated this negative carbon price. So first, I will introduce briefly where this calculation or estimate originated from. We have been working at the creation of a model called GSI Integrated Fiscal Model, GSI-IF, over the last few years. Now, this is work that started back in 2015. Some results were published in an initial report. We updated the report, expanding the list of countries in 2019. And we found different ways or facets of the modeling work that could be used for many different types of assessments and analysis, one of which is the estimation of the fossil fuel subsidy reform impact on emissions. So what we do with this model is to run different scenarios. One on removal of subsidies, two on adding taxes, fuel taxation, and three on reallocating some of the avoided costs, so subsidy savings and extra revenue from fuel taxation, to energy efficiency and renewable energy. So the model performs four key functions at the moment. It estimates the impact of subsidy removal on emissions. Similarly, the effect of changes in energy taxation and how that reduces emissions. And then how much of the savings we can accrue when we remove subsidies or increase taxes. And finally, the reallocation potential. So how to put these resources into good use to further reduce emissions. Now, at the moment, we have a model calibrated to 26 countries, and the model was designed to be developed quickly. So within 2 or 3 days, we could add a new country and perform an assessment along these four different scenarios that I mentioned. In this slide, you can see a brief schematic of how the model works. We estimate demand for energy using GDP, population forecast, technology, and then we single out the impact of prices, so the price effect. And this includes scenarios or forecasts on different energy prices, as well as subsidies and taxation, because they can increase or reduce the price of energy that is being felt at the market level. Now, why prices are important? Certainly for the policy entry point, but also because they lead to a substitution effect. So they lead to potential fuel switching for same or similar energy services that need to be provided. Now, once we know what is the impact of GDP, population, technology, prices resulting in substitution, we move on to calculate final demand, so consumption, actual consumption of energy, which is then the input for estimating emissions. So the model is structured in a way that it provides an entry point for testing different assumptions on scenario drivers, such as GDP and population, as well as on policy inputs that we can test. You can see here towards the center the role of subsidies and taxation, in that first they generate a price effect to generate substitution, but also the reallocation can lead to more energy efficiency and so reduce demand, or lead to fuel switching through the use or the expansion of the use of renewable energy. So this is in a nutshell how the model works. Some more details on the boundaries of the model and what is included in the model. So first of all, we only cover energy use and energy-related emissions. We don't touch upon land-related emissions. Then the energy demand is disaggregated into residential, commercial, industrial, and transport sectors. And we cover coal, petroleum products, natural gas, biofuels and waste, and electricity. So primary and secondary energy use. The time horizon simulation starts in 1990 and ends in 2040. So we do simulate in the past to be able to validate our forecasts against actual data, historical data, but then we push the simulation all the way to 2040 to understand the medium and longer term outcomes of policy implementation. Key assumptions, I mentioned this briefly before: future growth rate of GDP and population. These are based on the IMF World Economic Outlook, UN World Population Prospects. And then we add future energy prices, for which we have a baseline assumption. For instance, we follow the 10-year historical trend for oil. And then for coal and natural gas, biofuels and waste, we assume that they remain constant in real terms, or we end up simulating a variety of scenarios to show sensitivity of model outcomes to using different inputs. And then the energy efficiency improvement is currently based or uses a 1.5% ratio, or 1.5% rate every year, so that we don't exclude technological improvement, it's built in, but again, it's one of the assumptions that can be modified. So now on to the results, what we found. This is the same graph that Iveta was presenting before, and it represents method one, because we use two methods to do this estimate. This one is based on data. So first step was the estimation of the subsidy by country and energy source, so that we can go from the total amount of money, say millions or $1 billion, into an estimate that is $1 of subsidy per terajoule, per unit of energy. Then we consider the emission factors of each energy source. So what is the emission intensity per terajoule of oil, coal, gas, natural gas, and so on and so forth. Then as a third step, we calculate the subsidy per ton of CO2 for each of these specific fuels. And when we combine the fossil fuel subsidies provided by fuel in each of the countries, we obtain the diagram or the graph that you see at the bottom. We have countries with a very high value across all energy sources and subsidies provided, like Venezuela, which is skewed towards oil subsidies. We have other countries where we have a lower value, take Germany for instance, but on the other hand, in Germany there is a high subsidy provided to coal, which gets sort of leveled off. We have a smaller average value here because there is a comparatively smaller subsidy provided to oil and gas. So the comparison across countries gives you an idea of the state of play in 2016, the average value across all the countries we have analyzed, so not worldwide, just across the countries we have analyzed, is about $27 per ton of CO2. In the box, you see the breakdown by the type of fuel or energy source, also based on the countries we have analyzed, just to give you an idea of how they compare with one another. Now, second method. This is based not on the inputs that we use for the model, but on the outputs that we obtain from the model. It's not static, meaning that we use simulations. And so we look at the dynamic interplay of the factors I mentioned before, GDP, population, energy efficiency, prices and subsidies, in shaping the consumption of fuels to estimate what is the effective reduction of emissions when we remove subsidies. So 3 steps in this case as well. First, we simulate a baseline scenario to determine what is energy demand and what is the level of emissions that we obtain as a result. Second step, we simulate a fossil fuel subsidy removal scenario, and we estimate the amount of subsidy savings, so the amount of money saved by not implementing subsidies, and the resulting avoided emissions, because when we remove subsidies, the price of energy goes up. As a result, consumption goes down and emissions will be lower. And then as a third step, with the information mentioned above, we can calculate the amount of subsidy or avoided subsidy that we can save per ton of CO2. But in this case, over time, we do the calculation for 2025 as well as for 2030, and then we do an average between 2020 and 2030. Now, in this case, the average value adds up to $93.4 per ton across all the countries, considering all subsidies and all fuels through 2030. So now you can see how the removal of subsidies creates further synergies. It's not a one-time impact, but it's an impact that gets carried over through to 2030 as well as beyond. So there is to a limited extent, demand can adjust in the short term. There are some changes that will carry it over in the medium and longer term. Now, just to clarify, this calculation only refers to the impact on emissions of removing subsidies. What we do with the model, as I mentioned before, is actually a bit more articulate. We remove subsidies and we have emission reductions from subsidies only. Then after the subsidies are removed, we introduce a tax and we can estimate what is the reduction of emissions from the tax. Then we also reallocate 50% of the total extra revenues or avoided costs into energy efficiency and renewable energy. So we can distinguish between what we save from energy efficiency, what we save in terms of emissions from renewable energy, so that we can add up the total potential emission reduction from that initial policy input, that is subsidy removal and tax. Now, it has to be clear that the numbers I mentioned only refer to this area that you see at the top of this diagram. That is, they refer only to the emission reduction potential we get from removing subsidies, not from adding taxes and not from reallocating subsidy savings and extra tax revenues to energy efficiency and renewable energy. So this shows that there is an even more of an upside when we consider the potential impact on subsidy removal when we go beyond the impact of just removing subsidies, when we don't consider the reallocation. But of course, in order to avoid double counting, in order to avoid discussions about what is the best allocation of the subsidy savings in one or the other area, one or the other technology, it makes sense to start with an estimate of, does it make sense to remove subsidies? What is the impact? What is the corresponding value per ton of CO2? That is what we have done at this stage. Now, some considerations before I end my presentation. You have seen the graph before with the countries ranked from the largest value per ton of CO2 to the lowest value. Well, it's not enough to just look at that diagram. We need to add a few more thoughts to that. So first, the countries with the highest percent reduction in emissions, Venezuela, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, UAE, show an average reduction above 20% by 2030. These are the countries with the highest amount of subsidies as a share of GDP and as a share of the price of energy. So these are the countries you find on the left side, the ones with the highest bars. So not surprising, removing subsidies will have a positive impact here on emission reduction. On the other hand, the countries where we see the largest absolute reduction in emissions, where there is even more potential for reducing emissions by introducing carbon pricing, are China, the US, India, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Indonesia. So you can see here, these are much bigger countries where it's not the cost per ton that makes a big difference, it's the potential change that this carbon pricing will trigger in leveraging energy efficiency and fuel switching. investments. In fact, most of the reduction of emissions we see in these countries are not emerging from fossil fuel subsidy removal, but they're emerging from the reallocation of the subsidy savings and the energy tax to energy efficiency and renewable energy because of the proportionally larger size of the market. So this highlights that there is a good discussion to have with every country, not just those where you have a very high subsidy in relation to the price of energy or GDP, but also for all the other countries that have even larger markets, even if they have a smaller portion of subsidies as a share of GDP or prices. Because of carbon pricing, having the potential to tweak consumption in different ways, directly, because it's more economically viable to shift to other sources of energy, but also because they trigger new investments into providing the energy that is required by the sectors for given energy services that is less carbon intensive, such as renewable energy. So this ends my overview of the work we have performed so far, and I welcome any comment and further exchanges. Thank you very much. Over to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. Yeah, that was a fascinating presentation. I think it's a really key point about how subsidy reform can be a catalyst for fuel switching and energy efficiency. So now we're moving on to our third presentation of the webinar. So I'd like to welcome Jonas Tusch from OECD, the Center for Tax Policy and Administration. And he's going to be talking about effective tax policy post-COVID-19. We've heard a bit from some of the other presentations how fossil fuel subsidies reform is one part of the fiscal picture, but tax is the other key element. Andrea hinted about moving into a kind of tax reallocation period, and also Iveta talked about how there was three forces: taxes, carbon pricing, and subsidy reform are all part of the picture. So now it's good to move to the OECD. So Jonas with his thoughts on effective carbon pricing post COVID-19.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll try to share my screen. This one here. Oops. I think it's not full screen yet, right?
Yeah, not full screen yet.
Sorry about this, 1 second. Yeah, there we go. Can you see it now?
Perfect, yeah, that's great, thank you.
Yes, so as you said, well, you spoke a lot about effective carbon pricing already, so I think I can be brief on some parts of the presentation and then focus on the tax policy context right now and discuss a bit of how making progress in the current context could look like. Yeah, so I want to generally discuss briefly three things. Why price carbon? We've spoken a lot about this. Where do we stand at the moment with carbon prices? We've already heard. And when I talk about carbon prices, I would always take a broader approach that includes fossil fuel subsidies, includes energy taxes, and also includes, of course, explicit forms of carbon pricing, such as emissions trading systems and explicit carbon taxes. And then the last part for discussion, as I mentioned, how to make progress in the current context. I think it was very clear in Andrea's presentation, so I don't have to talk much about it. Carbon pricing can encourage consumers and producers to make cleaner choices. We saw evidence of fuel switching, for instance, and how this works in his model, so that was very helpful. I put in some pictures, right? So the kind of cleaner choices we can make, we can invest more in renewable electricity, for instance. So there are many ways the price can affect behavior and can guide investors in making cleaner choices and avoiding essentially stranded assets. Because if we believe that we are moving to a carbon neutral economy, investing in brown assets today is dangerous because these may become sort of zombie assets in the future. Of course, pricing carbon isn't only about changing behavior. It can also contribute to a lot of other tax and fiscal policy goals. We heard a lot about raising revenues. These revenues can, of course, put to good use. We heard about the option to use it to, for instance, invest in energy efficiency. There's, of course, also the important option to use it to address distributional concerns, to support vulnerable groups, to make them actually better off than before the reform. And also, carbon pricing can, of course, contribute to competitiveness in various ways. You can think about long-run competitiveness, as I mentioned, avoiding stranded assets. You can also think about short-run competitiveness, and there are people often concerned, but the evidence actually is at current price levels, there is not too much to worry about, and I'll get back to that towards the end of the presentation. So we talked a lot about effective carbon pricing, and I just want to talk about three related OECD work streams. Where do we stand? I talk about taxing energy use. This is essentially the triangle Iveta showed. This is the energy taxation part. Then there's effective carbon rates, which also looks at emissions trading systems. So that's more the carbon pricing part, even though there's quite a lot of overlap. And then finally, I think with this audience, many of you are familiar with this publication. It's the OECD inventory of support measures for fossil fuels, which is led by colleagues in the Environment Directorate of the OECD. So let me start with the taxing energy use. What we found in a report published last year is that energy tax systems still provide too little incentive to move to cleaner energy. And I think that was also very clear in both Iveta's and Andrea's presentation. We look at energy use and its taxation across 44 OECD and G20 economies. And we find that actually 70% of energy-related CO2 emissions are not taxed at all. So when we talk about energy-related CO2 emissions, that doesn't only look at the energy sector, that also means, of course, the road sector, which uses fossil fuels, industrial sectors, and so on and so forth. So all emissions related to energy use and most emissions of greenhouse gases are related to energy use. In terms of conclusions, we found out that there are actually a couple of sectors, and this is already mentioned as well in the presentations, where carbon prices are very low. So, and certain fuels as well. So coal is on average hardly taxed. And there are certain sectors like international aviation and shipping where prices are essentially close to zero or zero in many cases. One thing specifically on electricity taxes was that these are generally not differentiated by energy source. So they're not as good as they could be at providing incentives for using cleaner fuels. There's also some scope to not always increase taxes, but also to redesign taxes that they provide better incentives for from a climate perspective. Some details just to make sure what we mean by effective carbon taxes. This is simply, in our approach, the sum of the fuel excise tax and the explicit carbon tax. As mentioned, generally very low for coal. And also important to realize that to this date, fuel excise taxes are still a lot higher than explicit carbon taxes, even though we have a lot of initiatives coming up, and Sebastian will talk about these afterwards, but still for the moment, especially because of the relatively high rates in road transport for diesel and gasoline, excise taxes still dominate. And when I talk about high and low, I mean, of course, I have some sort of carbon price benchmark in mind. What we do in the report, we say people have different opinions of how high carbon prices should be, but people generally think that should at least be around 30 euros per ton of CO2 emitted. So that's what we compare these values to in the report. Of course, going forward, people generally read higher prices than that. Let me quickly look at, we talked a lot about road transport, and when one listens to discussions on carbon taxation in the media or reads newspaper articles, one often gets the impression it's all about the road sector. But it's important to understand that actually most emissions don't come from the road sector. It's certainly a very important sector to decarbonize. I have to think how to do that, but their taxes are already relatively high. And there are many, and it's politically difficult to reform. So let's not forget that most emissions come from other sectors, and that's really something where we also need to make progress if we want to move to carbon neutral economies by mid-century or shortly thereafter. Then I mentioned already, we have another publication that also looks at emissions trading systems. These are mostly applied to industrial and power sector emissions to date. Adding these, of course, increases effective carbon prices, but still, even when we take these together, tax and emissions trading systems, only 10% of emissions are priced above this low-end carbon benchmark of Euro 30. So there's a lot of room for improvement also there. I think at the moment, the European emissions trading system is at 20 euros per ton of CO2. So it's below this benchmark at the moment during the crisis. well, we heard a lot about fossil fuel subsidies. So I mentioned we also have a long-standing publication series on this. There's a lot of detail in there on also the production side, because to date, the effective carbon rate, this focuses on consumption taxes, and it's also important, of course, to keep in mind that there's production support, as Andrea pointed out. So that's another publication that gives a lot of details on the delivery mechanisms through which governments support fossil fuels in various forms. And we've heard already the aggregate numbers from previous panelists. Well, of course, these are all publications published before the crisis. So what has changed in the current context? We were actually asked by the G20 presidency to prepare a report on the tax and fiscal policy response in response to the COVID crisis. Peter also spoke about this. Of course, the immediate concern is to use tax and fiscal policy to shore up business liquidity, support low-income workers, keep workers in the labor market. Then as the crisis moves on, there's of course also need to deal with solvency risks, not only liquidity risks. But once containment measures can be lifted, there's certainly space and a need for stimulus to encourage a strong and swift recovery. And this stimulus could, and I think many people in the audience would say should, be used to also pursue certain environmental objectives, climate, biodiversity. And one thing one could, of course, do in the stimulus packages is to build in conditionality. Not all economic activity is equally valuable in the long run, and that would be something that stimulus packages could potentially address. We also make clear that, of course, at some point there will be the time to restore public finances. This is not the policy focus right now, but the debate on how this could be done in the future should start. And there we do mention carbon prices as part of a balanced budget sharing. So we also have this role in mind that Peter mentioned of carbon pricing as being able to contribute to public finances. But let's return a bit more to carbon prices as a means to direct investments for a greener recovery. Generally, it's quite clear that strong carbon price signals can help channel investments into assets that are aligned with countries' long-term priorities. But we also know that the political economy is challenging, right? Both the fossil fuel subsidy reform, energy tax reform, and explicit carbon price reform. Raising energy prices, which is a big part of carbon pricing, is not necessarily popular with the electorate and also certain interest groups. So the first question for discussion really is, how should we think about timing carbon price reform in the current context? Iveta mentioned there's scope, and there's also some evidence, and countries have been able to use the low oil prices right now to raise excise taxes. We also know that designing carbon pricing reform packages that are politically feasible is challenging, takes time, and it's clear that at the moment finance ministries are also very busy to deal with the immediate impact of the crisis. So there's also a challenge, of course, to develop a policy package that works in the current context. But it's equally clear that if we don't get prices right, we may end up with the wrong kind of investments now, right? So there's really a thing to how can we make progress in the current context. I think what's clear is that addressing distributional and affordability issues will only become more important. Right? If you look at the current crisis, it seems to be hitting vulnerable groups harder than, say, white-collar workers who are more easily able to work from home. So getting these compensation policies right and really thinking through the reform processes to make sure that vulnerable groups are not hit too hard is key. If we think about investments, of course, carbon prices today matter, but what really matters is expectations about carbon prices in the future. So often low carbon assets will have relatively long lifetimes. So what really matters is the carbon price in 5, in 10, in 20 years. And if we want prices to guide these investments, which would be nice because prices are a very general form of support, so we don't have to pick technologies. We don't have to know what's the right way forward. We can just provide the price signal, leave it to entrepreneurs and engineers out there to find the best solutions to cut emissions. But how can we credibly commit to this in the future? And one thing that has prevented governments from making progress with carbon prices were concerns that this may lead to carbon leakage and competitiveness issues. In particular, if certain countries are more ambitious than others, and that's what we see, then if prices get very high in some places and in others, there's a risk that certain trade exposed sectors might relocate their activities, for instance. We also know that at current price levels, this hasn't really happened that much, or actually there's very little evidence of negative competitiveness effects. But there's of course a concern that it could change if prices get a lot higher. And then is the question, do we need new tools to address that? And I see that Susanne is speaking after me. She's one of the most distinguished experts on border carbon adjustments. So that's one thing that has been mentioned more and more frequently recently because it's part of the European Green New Deal proposal. So maybe we'll hear more about that. And then there's the question, of course, whether we need specific pricing instruments for harder to abate sectors. We know that, for instance, for steel, also in aviation, we would need relatively high prices to really trigger investments and developments of new technologies that would be consistent then with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And the question is, if we cannot commit to like a broad carbon price across all sectors for the future right now, maybe we can commit to higher prices for specific sectors. There are some ideas around this, for instance, on carbon contracts for difference that could be a bit similar to feed-in tariffs offered to, for instance, lower carbon building materials and so on and so forth. There are also ideas about that have been floated by some members of the policy community on consumption charges for certain, say, carbon-intensive materials to then provide incentives for people to switch to cleaner materials. So there are a lot of other price-based instruments, and that's another question for discussion, whether we need these complementary instruments as well. I will leave it at this for now, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jonas. That was fascinating, very clear, and you raised some important questions there. I think we can. It's quite striking to think about the percentage of only 18% of non-road emissions being adequately covered by taxes, and only I think it was only 20% of emissions priced above 30 euros a ton. So that's it's quite a mountain still to climb. Right. Now we're talking more about carbon, and we're talking about progress in terms of carbon and how that's changed over time. So I4CE produce an estimate of the revenues raised by various carbon pricing schemes, both emissions trading schemes and taxes. And now I'm very pleased to welcome Sebastian Postic to talk about those estimates and how they've changed over time and what that tells us about how the context is changing for raising revenues from carbon pricing, and also the effective cost of carbon that businesses and activities are paying. So Sebastian, the floor is yours. If you'd like to share your screen, then we'd welcome your presentation.
So hi everyone, I'm happy to speak at this webinar. The previous panelists have already given a very complete presentation, so I'll try to do what I can to expand and complete the perspective. As Richard was saying, we've just updated this work about what is the state of carbon prices on the world today. So this is the global map in terms of coverage. It has been mentioned already. It's around 60% of GDP global in terms of countries that is now covered by a carbon price. But these prices range from less than $1 to $120 more or less. And one main caveat to this figure is the fact that China is considered as covered by carbon price, but actually its national ETS has not come effective yet. It's still in testing phase, and as was demonstrated before by Andrea, it's a big chunk actually still out of the scope, even though it appears that as covered by a mechanism at least. For the new countries this year, we're counting in the Canada's federal mechanism, who after a while, long negotiations have come live. It's a complex mechanism since the federal government is imposing a carbon price for every province that hasn't already its own carbon price. So in the end, it's a very complex mix of blend of provincial mechanisms and federal mechanisms. But the key point is that the federal backstop mechanism is the minimal price for the whole country and is raising is now at 20 Canadian dollars per ton. Should have been raised this year at the 1st of April, but due to COVID, not all provinces have. It should climb by 2023 to 50 Canadian dollars per ton. So it's bound to become an important carbon pricing one. The other two countries that implemented their carbon price this year are South Africa and Singapore. South Africa is the result of a very long process of several years trying to discussion in Congress to be able to implement this carbon price, and it's also a step forward for carbon pricing in developing countries. What we see now is that after being specific to developed countries, carbon pricing is now making headway both in developed and developing countries, and that's something that is very new, and at least the trend is continued this year. That's pretty much covers it, I think. Regarding revenues, so the whole revenue raised in 2019 was around $50 billion. So this has to be compared with the numbers and figures displayed by Iveta and Andrea of carbon, of energy taxation, and also of fossil fuel subsidies. This is a very small figure compared to these two ones, but still keeps growing. The biggest chunk and the biggest increase actually happened last year when the prices of the European mechanisms, cap and trade mechanism, jumped from around $5 to now more than $20. So this is something that we are currently testing with COVID to see if the prices of the European market crash or not. So far, they are holding. It's not clear what the long term will be, but so far the market stability reserve mechanism put in place by the European Commission to avoid very low prices, such as the ones which followed the 2008 crisis, seems to work correctly. What else can be drawn as key messages from this chart is that so far it's half and half nearly for carbon taxes and carbon markets in terms of revenues raised. And most of the revenues so far as well as are raised in Europe or in the European Union even. So due to Brexit, we are now separating we will be soon separating the figures for the European markets for the United Kingdom, but still without counting United Kingdom, we are more than 65%, I would say, of revenues raised within the European Union. What else can be said here? We can see at the outer circle the revenue use and how revenues are split in terms of 4 categories, which are general budget allocation, tax exemption, direct transfers, and earmarking. The two main, by far, categories are general budget allocation and earmarking. But this has to be nuanced in 2 ways. The first one is that the biggest chunk of these revenues are raised by the EU ETS and France, so the choices of these 2 countries or these 2 jurisdictions drive the whole picture. And the second reason is that we've found in a review performed for the World Bank that any type of revenue use can display a very successful implementation in the country.
We seem to have some sound problems from Sebastian here. I think he's dropped.
Which part did you miss?
Sorry, yeah, you were just talking about the earmarking, and yeah, you dropped off slightly.
Yeah, here. Sorry about that. It was where did I lose you?
You just started on the next slide, Sebastian.
Okay, here, perfect.
Yeah.
So yeah, saying that we've conducted a review of different countries and how they type to gather the in Sweden with the tax reform, and also in British Columbia with tax cuts. Ireland used it in the general budget and the reform went fine. Switzerland returns directly the money to the citizens and it also works fine. So the key message from this slide is that the way revenue is returned to the citizen is not per se the only success factor for a carbon pricing scheme, and the discussion really matters, but the final decision is really up to each country. Trying to take a step back from that, so explicit carbon prices, as was shown by the previous panelists, covers a very narrow range of carbon emissions. I've put it like the two, like the icons for road, fuel transport, and carbon markets. And what we found is that it could be spent in 4 categories, but it's still a narrow description. If we try to take a step back from that, we've already talked a lot about fossil fuel subsidies, but we can still expand the picture to the whole tax and spending system of the state. So if we tried this exercise in France at some point, and what we can see here, I'll just walk you through some of the results of this slide, but on the right-hand part of the slide, we have the climate damaging spending of the state, and most of it, actually 95%, near to 95% of it is made up of fossil fuel subsidies. So that's an interesting information. Combining the whole spending of the state, most of the climate damage comes in France from fossil fuel subsidies. Regarding taxes, at the bottom of the slide, we see that carbon explicit or carbon-based taxes, not only explicit carbon taxes, but carbon-based taxes make 10 billion euros in France, of 33 billion euros of total climate, what we identified as of people, like changing, beneficial to climate change mitigation. And also on the last part, the green part at the left of this chart states all the climate-friendly spending we identified for France, and it adds up to 20 billion euros, which is much more than, actually twice the all carbon-based taxes in France. And it's like for the record, the explicit carbon tax generates $8 billion euros. Sorry, so it's again a bit more than twice this order of magnitude. Okay, this is a zooming on France's main subsidies to see how much guess how much emissions are covered and to which discount the benefits from. And what we see that some chunks of CO2 emissions like aircraft kerosene are not so big in terms of the size of the total emission they represent, but the discount they have for not being taxed at all is really important. So in the end, the revenue lost from this such an exemption is really high compared to, for example, it compares with the diesel gasoline difference we have in France, which covers much more emissions, but with a very lesser rate. Trying to take a step back still, the interest of having conducted this exercise is trying to understand how the how the state acts as an actor to redirect the whole climate financial flows within the economy. So we've tried to map the whole financial flows in the economy, and for each investment, who funds it and how this funder is himself funded, trying to identify the part which belongs to the public administration and the part which belongs to financial institutions and households and private companies. What is interesting in this overall picture, which only pictures investment, is that we already match the size of the whole carbon revenues in the world for 1 year, which is around 50 billion euros in this case. And the other information is that we've tried to conduct a review of how the post-COVID recovery could be shaped for the French government, and what we found is with the current frame of investments that you have here, injecting around 7 billions in public investment could lead to nearly 20 billions of total climate investment in the country right now. I won't go into detail of where this investment would be on the disaggregation. You can find the whole information in the last publication here, which is a few weeks old now. So I hope I was clear despite the sound, and I'm leaving it back.
Okay, thank you very much, Sebastian. I think we've had a few sound problems, but it was worth it because that was such an interesting presentation. I think that what a number of the speakers are raising here is the need to kind of understand this green versus brown split between investment, expenditure, and revenue generation, and when we're evaluating stimulus packages and investment more generally, I think that kind of understanding and being able to monitor that split is really important. So now, without further ado, I'd like to move over to Suzanne Drug, who's a senior fellow at SWP, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. So Suzanne, you've been very patient, and so Suzanne will respond to some of the points raised by the other panelists, and also may wish to raise some of her own perspectives on these issues around fossil fuel subsidies, taxation, and carbon pricing. So thank you, Suzanne, and welcome to the webinar.
Yes, thanks, Richard, and thanks to all the presenters. That was very insightful, and I will have a few comments and questions maybe to stimulate the discussion. First of all, I think the report we started with, and also the other information we received from the presenters, they deliver a number of valuable arguments, specifically because we know now what the numbers are in aggregate we're talking about when it is coming to carbon pricing. And I didn't hear what the 26 countries are from the modeling exercise, so please let us know what types of countries were in this pool, because I think this matters as well. Yeah, and then it is probably very valuable for finance ministers to have these numbers ready when they want to move on to couple the pandemic recovery from the pandemic to such a reform. I think what we have to keep in mind when talking about post-corona is that we are not there yet. I mean, we are talking about 1.5 years where probably the whole insecure situation will continue. So the numbers, the total financial dimension of what this crisis could mean is totally uncertain to me. We have preliminary numbers for this year, what kind of bailout is being planned for. But actually the difference here is that it's not a one-time shock. We could have second or third waves of the infection and we don't know where we're going to. So I think this insecurity is really special. But still, the knowledge you produced is an entry point to talk to policymakers. I like it very much. And to find out about fiscal priorities also needs to be added to this picture. I think we heard already from France, from Sébastien, what is going on in that respect. And I think this would be a valuable thing to do next, and probably also the OECD is the right place to do so. So how do countries see their fiscal situation? What do they plan? Probably also what did we learn from 2009 when there was a collapse in the financial system. Now, I also think, because I was addressed as someone working on water adjustments, which is a nice to have additional tool in creating revenues, I would really like to draw the attention to the EU Green Deal, because so far politically the agenda is still being supported. This deal has only 2 out of the 3 tools you mentioned under investigation, because it is looking into the Energy Tax Directive of the EU and of course carbon pricing as a means to deliver on the new 2030 target and the long-term goal of greenhouse gas neutrality. But it's not including anything on fossil fuel subsidies, as far as I can tell. So I think pushing into that direction at the EU level could be of interest. I wonder what you think about that one. And yesterday, the Commission asked the EU member states for a 500 billion euro support program. And I think this is an interesting thing to also couple to the revenue side. Where should the money come from? We know that, at least in Germany, consumption subsidies for fossil fuels do not prevail, but we know that, for instance, production subsidies are still in place. I don't want to be too pessimistic, ending up with a brief look into the multilateral perspective or in the situation, but we know also that multilaterally pushing for such reform has become even more complicated during the last 2 to 3 years. And I see that the G20 will be an important place to look into subsidies, because Saudi Arabia is the presidency now. But this is very special, and I wonder how the presenters see this as another entry point into a reform and taking advantage of what they have presented. As we know, when oil prices decline, like in 2015, governments have an interest in buffering the producer countries' governments have an interest in buffering their losses. So many points made. I hope I'm not too long here. So just to give you an overview how I would identify important linkage to the policy arena right now, this year, not probably next year anymore. We don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. That's fascinating. So I think before perhaps we could ask if any of the panelists wish to respond to some of the points that Suzanne raised before we move on to questions from the audience. So specifically, the impact of the Green New Deal and 500 billion euros in support. And I think a very interesting topic that Suzanne raised was on producer subsidies. As in Ivetta's presentation, she mentions that the fall in oil prices and energy prices generally are leading to a collapse in consumer subsidies, but the shutdowns and are leading to kind of reductions in demand that are also very much placing producers in precarious situations, leading to rising demands for producer subsidies. And coupled with Saudi Arabia's chairing of the G20, do we expect to see an increasing role for producer subsidies? And is that something that, what are the issues for producer subsidy reform? So there's a lot to be going at there. Is there anyone who wishes to respond to that? I think maybe we'll just, there's not so many of us, so maybe just chip in. If not, I can pick on people if
Hi, Rich. I can answer a couple of questions. Also one question from the audience, and just hand over then to others because Susanna's comments were addressed to several people. So in terms of the G20 and Saudi Arabia chairing G20, we are preparing a scorecard this year, which will rank all G20 countries in terms of their progress on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And Saudi Arabia is not the worst performer as far as we can see, because we don't know much about their production subsidies, but we know that production costs are generally very low there. Therefore, production subsidies probably are not too significant, because they tend to be higher in the high-cost countries, and that's why they are higher in countries like Germany or Canada or the United States. So Saudi Arabia has large consumption subsidies, and they have reformed some of them, so they have made some progress, and they will be pushed to reform them further because of the oil price drop. They have a very big gap in the budget. So in terms of G20, as I said in the beginning, they have a commitment for medium-term reform of fossil fuel subsidies, which is 10 years old. So medium-term has definitely passed. They haven't done much progress, partly because of on purpose disagreeing on the definition of fossil fuel subsidies. The way around was through peer reviews, and in this sense, countries which are set on reforming fossil fuel subsidies can use peer review as a way to push for reforms domestically, so they have kind of an international benchmark. And that's exactly the logic that the Obama administration used for the US-China peer review. This particular year, I think, will be very difficult for this agenda. It was already struggling in previous years, and there is more discussion of more platforms. So we don't see G20 as a single platform for this type of discussions, but also SDG indicators. We've seen this agenda championed by the UN Secretary General. We've also seen a lot of commitment from Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform and their drive in the WTO, World Trade Organization, to discipline fossil fuel subsidies. And then it's ultimately also down to governments and their commitment to reform. So in this sense, I'd like to pick up on the question from the chat from Eric Beer, who asked about also about platforms, but also about how we can go from negative carbon pricing in about 70% of countries to positive carbon pricing. And here it's a lot about communication, and it's a lot about political economy, because fossil fuel subsidy reform or increased taxation is seen as governments taking something away from people. So definitely we cannot just take away things, we need to give back. And communication should be framed around giving back and how this money is going to be spent transparently, of course. And we know it's a very sensitive topic. So social mitigation policies are extremely important. So we, for developing countries, work a lot on targeting support, moving it away from fossil fuels, blanket subsidies to fossil fuels, into targeted measures to support households and other vulnerable groups who really need this support, because there are better ways to deliver it than blanket fossil fuel subsidies. So it should be a lot about communication, explaining the rationale. For instance, I think everyone remembers the Yellow Vest protests in France, and it's certainly an issue of communication that people were not informed, like they were not engaged in the social dialogue about this type of reforms. And also, as I said, it shouldn't be just about carbon pricing. It should be about energy taxation. And I'd like to finish with the example of India. It's not a perfect example, but still, if you look at India and they say we're going to price carbon through a coal cess on production, cess as a tax on production. Because it's difficult to tax consumers, but you can tax producers. And the other interesting bit about this tax was that it was, at least in the beginning, earmarked for environmental purposes. Earmarking is difficult because it creates additional transaction costs, layers of bureaucracy, but it makes the reform politically more acceptable because people know where the money is going to. So in more recent years, India actually dropped the earmarking, but the tax still remains, and it's a tax on coal production, and it's a tax effective at $4 per ton of carbon equivalent. And the final point on platforms, Ambassador Wahlberg mentioned the coalition of finance ministers for carbon pricing. I'm sorry, the coalition of finance ministers for climate action. And that's the type of audiences which are now also thinking and designing stimulus packages. So that's really like the most important platform to talk about right now. Finance ministers, the World Bank, IMF, and all these organizations are very much in line on taking on fossil fuel subsidy reform. That's kind of my attempt to reply to several points in the discussion.
Thank you, Iveta. That's a lot to get back to there, and a lot that came up. So thank you very much for your contributions. Next, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to go one round through the panelists as we go, and I'll invite the panelists to pick up any of the questions from the Q&A, plus the questions that Suzanne raised, plus anything else they'd like to respond to. So, and then at the end, we'll close the webinar at 11:45. So until that point, well, I'll be prompting the panelists with questions, but we'll have one run through first, just so everyone gets a chance to respond to things other people have said. So next up, Andrea Bassi, responding to a number of points about modeling. There's also so anything else you'd like to pick up on as well, Andrea? One other question that was in the Q&A was that whether you could add a layer to model to look at social impacts and societal feasibility of subsidy reform, and if that's something you've considered.
Yes, thank you, Richard. I'll be brief, and thank you all for the very interesting questions. So first, if you'd like to have more information on the model and the analysis, the countries analyzed were presented in small prints in one of the slides, but I will add, as soon as I'm done with this Q&A, I will add the links to the reports that we have already published to the chat, so that you have access to all the PDF files. Then to answer specific questions in the Q&A, in this study and what I've presented, we focus on consumption and not on production subsidies. But we have done another study, I will add the link to that as well, that specifically targets production subsidies. The report we published is called Zombie Energy. That's easy to find, and I will add the link. There are important differences in the modeling approach that needs to be taken when we look at consumption and production subsidies, so you'll find more details there. Then in terms of the social impacts, we are working towards the expansion of the model to add impacts of fossil fuel use and emissions on health specifically. So we are moving in the direction of looking at the health impact, but then it is also possible to add economic impacts. If you're able to track energy consumption by a population group or household groups based on household surveys, so that we can see what is the potential impact of changes in prices on the economic welfare of different population groups. This being said, we have to acknowledge that what we have developed, the GSI-IF model, is not the best tool to do this type of analysis. It's not designed to do that. Different types of models, including national level computable general equilibrium CG models, equipped with that level of detail in the energy sector, may be better suited to do this type of analysis. And also with IISD, we have done similar work using these type of models and more detailed energy systems models to analyze the impacts of fossil fuel subsidy removal, especially distributional impacts on population. Then on the other questions raised by Susanne, first of all, I think the Green New Deal has the potential to reduce the need for subsidies if it is capable of increasing energy efficiency and so pushing down to a certain extent energy consumption or making energy use more efficient. Now that has a direct impact in that it reduces the energy bill, the cost of energy consumed for households and businesses, and hence it reduces the need for the extra support to push economic growth. If the Green New Deal then also increases employment and improves opportunities for employment creation for various population groups, then it triggers economic growth while at the same time pushing down energy consumption and energy use overall. So I see that as being a potential synergy to be exploited, which also calls for the reallocation of subsidy savings into new activities, the big investment package being envisaged. Then on the production subsidy specifically, we have to mention that everything we have said now, everything that pushes down demand, everything that pushes down prices, practically prompts a request from producers to receive support. So that cannot be avoided. The only way to get through this in the medium and longer term is to make so that demand gradually declines so that there is a clear message for the medium and longer term to investors as well as producers that this is not an area worth investing in. And so if you reduce the amount of money going into a sector, we reduce the potential to have stranded assets over time, and hence we reduce the need for support to make sure that whatever asset is in place now or will be in place in the future will lead to the returns that are expected, so the economic returns that are expected. So I see here again an important synergy emerging in the medium and longer term if the right investments are implemented. So that is all from my side. I'll add links to the reports right away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That's very interesting. Next, I'd like to come to Jonas if he's available.
Yes.
So there's a few questions there specifically aimed to the OECD. I don't know if you've seen some of those. I'll just pick one out, which is how influential can you really be? What are the best decision-making policy fora to advance these issues? How successful is subsidy reform and kind of environmental fiscal reform more generally at the G20, at the G7, at the OECD, within the OECD members? And where do you see the opportunities? There's also a lot of other points as well, but I'll let you pick up on areas that you found were interesting during the presentations.
Thank you, Richard. Many pertinent points. So about the role of international institutions, I think one really key role we shouldn't forget is still about knowledge sharing, because when people or governments consider carbon pricing reform, back in the old days, there was little precedents. Right now, we have a lot of experiences. I think that was very clear from Sebastian's presentation, a lot of different forms of carbon pricing, explicit and implicit. So a lot to learn from. So governments can discuss how have they dealt with, say, pressures from industry, how have they dealt with affordability concerns by poor households. There's a lot of knowledge sharing that could be done. And I would also second the point on the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. I think that's a coalition that's really gaining traction. The OECD is also involved as an institutional partner, among others under Principle 3, which works on effective carbon pricing. So that's certainly a forum where governments can exchange best practices and think together to find solutions. Generally, yeah, you can think about solutions unilaterally, think about what you can do by yourself, But you can also think, of course, multilaterally, right? So if countries were to start discussing among themselves how to coordinate their policies, that's also a possibility. And I wouldn't want to single out a specific institutions to do that. I saw a number of questions that were interesting. I'll just pick maybe two. One was on the Euro 30 benchmark. How do we actually get there, especially in the developing world, if even in many OECD countries, prices are still lower for a certain, especially for industrial emissions. And I think, first, I wouldn't want to see this low-end benchmark as some sort of minimum. Every progress towards carbon pricing is valuable, right? So even if you only have a carbon tax at lower levels, say 5 euros per ton of CO2, 10 euros per ton of CO2, these are valuable steps. So one shouldn't stop reforming just because even after the reform would still be below the benchmark. And I think there's a lot to learn from the experience that before implementing reforms, governments thought, okay, the impacts on industry will be very bad, but in the end, there were hardly any impacts of the current price level. So actually, it's quite encouraging that starting with carbon price reform isn't the end of the world. And one last point, and also getting a seconding actually Andreas' response to Susanne's question on how can we now link sort of the support programs to carbon pricing. I mentioned before, of course, having a price signal also helps to guide these investments. But yeah, there are indeed synergies if you invest, say, in energy efficiency that will facilitate future carbon price reforms because it will be cheaper to comply with any carbon price policy. So that's, I think, one of the promising things to look forward to, that we could potentially make it easier to move forward with carbon pricing in the future.
I just wondered, there were quite a few questions around specifically what has changed around carbon pricing and taxation revenues around, specifically around COVID. So we haven't kind of dwelt too much on the immediate. So I wondered if you had any kind of reflections just on, like in the really short term, kind of how has this changed things? How has this changed the agenda for implementing carbon pricing schemes? Does that make it more important, or does it kind of create a barrier to implementation that wasn't there before?
I mean, in the very short term, I mean, I guess Iveta had the optimistic perspective that it really presents an opportunity. Of course, I think governments, as I mentioned before, are very much focused on, and rightly focused on, dealing with the immediate health crisis. And in many cases, it may mean that maybe immediate reform is not possible, but we can of course make progress in thinking of how to reform and phasing in the reform once the recovery is on track, right? So we, as Susanne mentioned, it's not very clear exactly where we are, how long it's going to take us to overcome the immediate health crisis. But once the recovery is on track, I think then phasing in gradually higher prices could become an opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Sebastian, are you still on the line and ready to contribute? There was one question I noted particularly, which was talking about how when we see your map graphic of different carbon prices in different jurisdictions, there are often exemptions or parts that doesn't apply to. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you think about that. To what extent are carbon prices being applied across the economy versus on specific sectors? So maybe those headline numbers are sometimes a little bit misleading. So maybe you could just talk about the difficulties in understanding what the net carbon price is compared to some of the carbon prices that apply in different sectors, and also the role of allocating credits and those kind of things.
Yeah, I'll throw back part of the question to Jonas afterwards, because I think it's also a matter of effective carbon pricing, but trying to answer what I can answer here is that indeed there are a lot of exceptions, and the question was about South Africa, and South Africa so far has a nominal tax rate which doesn't cover for like 95% of industrial emissions, more or less. This is problematic in the sense that these emissions are not paid for so far, so there's no incentive such as it is to reduce emissions. But yet, in the case of, there are several cases actually. In the case of like South Africa, we know that there are exemptions that will be phased out eventually. So there's still a signal for companies that this carbon price will eventually kick in. So it's way different from sectors where you don't have any, you have an exemption without any time limit. And in these sectors, it is interesting to look at what is done not in terms of carbon pricing. In some sectors, trying to make an example, in some sectors from like building renovation, building retrofit, it's very hard to pass consumer signal through a carbon price. So you have at some point to just give up the economic signal which doesn't work in some cases, and try other ways like information, helping, like stepping in as the state to put like some rules, building rules and so far. So there are some sectors where it doesn't apply yet and it will. There are some sectors where it can't be effective as a climate tool, even though it could raise revenue, but it won't have an effect as a climate incentive. So it's better to look for other ways. In the end, carbon pricing is more like a safety net for to be sure that everybody sees some sort of signal, but where it doesn't work, well, it just doesn't work, and you have to find other ways. And maybe I would like to step from there to what has changed in carbon pricing. So what we've seen so far, I've already talked a bit about Canada, where some tax increases have been delayed. They're not the only country in the world in terms of taxes. What we've seen so far is not like rollback of taxes, but so the advance has stopped so far, most of it on or like planned increases have been delayed. The pattern is a bit more complex for ETSs, where the prices is not given, are not given by the state in the end. So we are still waiting to see where they will head in the coming weeks. So far, what we've seen is there hasn't been any crash in the main carbon markets in the world, but it's still to be seen in the end how this affects prices in the long term. And maybe taking up the topic of using the present crisis context to raise prices, this has been a call from many, and it is sensitive, but the French experience is there to provide a stark warning on that. You really need money. There's a national narrative behind that you really need money for COVID, and carbon pricing can be a way to raise some of the money, and that's interesting. But in France, what we've done is that we used the low carbon tax unnoticed and compensate for the drop in oil prices with the rise of the carbon tax. And when the prices of oil raised back, we got the yellow vests. So it is really a matter of if you use or if you raise carbon prices in a context of low oil prices, you have to think that these prices of oil will climb back, and and what will people think at this moment? And if you haven't prepared for that, the crash will happen a few years afterwards. And after you passed your prices. So you have to be very cautious on that. This being said, it is still interesting to raise the money. And here I'm trying to answer some question about the narrative on developing countries. There are a lot of reasons, and COVID is only one of them actually, for which the state would need money. And there, carbon pricing, I mean, these contexts are interesting because carbon pricing is a real way to raise money for the state, while having a positive climate impact. And this being said, you can see carbon pricing as a climate impact with a revenue effect, or you can see carbon pricing as a revenue raising means that is interesting also from a climate perspective. And this is a narrative that works well actually, because IGETA is better placed than me to talk about that, but most fossil fuel subsidy reforms that were undertaken in developing countries were so because of revenue issues for the state, and not often because of climate concerns. So this is something that can be built on, but you have to be really careful on how you communicate and how you bring people together on a common narrative on that. And maybe like one last very technical question about ETS being more efficient than carbon taxes, or the reverse. Usually what we see is that ETS are more suited for large industries because their design is much more complex than carbon taxes, and the range of question they raise is totally different from carbon taxes, of acceptability, of revenue raising, of stabilizing the prices, of incentives. They really are like two very different tools, and it's really hard to compare in the end.
Okay, thank you very much, Sebastian. And now Peter Wooders, our director, I'd like to ask you to make some final wrap-up remarks. Just before I go, I'd like to just thank all of the speakers and everyone involved in the webinar, and also, of course, all of the participants. So yeah, Peter, could you give us some concluding thoughts on what we've discussed and heard today?
Certainly, Richard. Thank you for moderating today. I mean, firstly, I've thoroughly enjoyed the webinar, learned a lot, and I think it's been an excellent way to help set the role that fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon pricing can play in this post-pandemic world that we face. We heard a lot of insights today. Right at the top, Ambassador Wahlberg asked us, do we want a better, more sustainable future? And led through some of the initiatives that could help us work through that, including the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and talked about as well how important circular economy as well as part of this debate is as well. I mean, I could go through and pick out insights from all of what we've heard today, but I think what the real question ahead of us is that looking forward, it's very, very clear that government budgets are going to be facing huge pressure in the months and the years ahead. And to some extent, what are we going to do as societies in that environment? Are we going to increase taxes on final goods through VAT or through other sort of measures like that? Are we going to try and widen tax bases in other ways, by taxing employment, by taxing industry, by taxing output? Are we going to reduce services? Are we going to even look at austerity measures and try and sort of bring our economies back into balance in that way? Now, none of those options is particularly attractive. And given that we are also facing a climate crisis, an incipient climate crisis, and we need to realign financial flows, we heard today from Jonas Tusch in particular how little of energy use is currently taxed outside the road sector in particular. It seems very, very clear that the environment for putting in extra carbon taxes, extra energy taxes, and doing more on subsidy reform looks like a very, very sensible strategy right now for governments at the moment. Clearly, there's political economy issues around that, and clearly it isn't going to be that straightforward. But I think it's on all of us to be really saying, well, how can we help push that forward? How can we use some of the entry points that Susanna Drugger very kindly opened up for us to make the case that we do need to finance the recovery, and that this is one of the least bad options, if not the least bad option in which to do so. So, of course, while we do that, we have to protect the vulnerable in our communities and our economies. There is a lot of learning about how carbon taxing has been done in the past and how fossil fuel subsidy reform has been done in the past, how it's gone well, how it's gone less well, how some of those lessons are there. And so facilitating the exchange of lessons learned is going to be very, very important. It's something that countries, for example, from the Nordic region have had a lot of experience of some of the Northern European countries as well. Environmental fiscal reform has been going on for 30 years, and to some extent this is a continuation of this, and we can be asking other countries to accelerate their way down that pathway as well. And I'd mention as well the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform group as being a key group within that. I think also as well, something that's come out today very strongly for me has been this idea of effective carbon prices, and that we need to bring carbon prices, energy taxation, and fossil fuel subsidies all into the same equations and start presenting that back to ministries of finance and others, so they have a good picture of really how energy is being supported or otherwise, and where the gaps are there that are going to stop us from getting towards where we need to be for a low carbon future. I think that's the sort of final point today is that the choices that governments make now are absolutely critical for whether we're going to lock in high or low carbon development for the decades to come. And that if we tackle those in the spirit of the SDGs and of the Paris Agreement, then the post-pandemic world can be one of much increased resilience and safe climate trajectories. So we very much look forward to working with all of you to make that vision into reality. I would note as well there's another webinar with a subsidies element to it next week, hosted by IISD on Thursday, the 28th of May at 1600 Central European Time, on trade and climate change after COVID-19, subsidies, stimulus and energy prices, and hopefully we'll be able to continue some of the conversations there. Otherwise, thank you very much for all of you who've participated today, for all of you who've asked questions, and mostly to our panelists and to our speakers for all their insights and their time. And I wish you well getting through this crisis, to you, to all your families, and we look forward to working with you going forward. So thank you very much, and hope we'll be in contact soon.